Okay, I'm going to do a basic thread wrap, and I think with the first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small piece of masking tape. This is what I used to do. I don't do it anymore. I just sort of freehand it. But when I first started, I did this. Just gave the start of my thread somewhere to rest against. It also gave me an equidistant space between the start of the thread wrap and the foot of each and every guide. Gave me that consistency, but now I just tend to eyeball it, and it works okay for me as well. If you don't want to do this, that's fine. I just thought I'd show you that. With this type of wrapper, the thread's coming from over here, and what you want to start with is not an angle like that. You want a slight angle that way. So my thread wraps are going this way. My thread angle should be that way, which it is just slightly. You don't want it too much, otherwise your thread will want to migrate back that way. So I come over the top and then around the top again. And what this tape allows me to do is I can just push that thread right back against the tape like that. So now I've got the thread all the way around the blank. What I want to do now is put my thumb there, because I want to keep constant tension on the thread. If I let it go, it just all comes loose. Okay, so you want constant thread tension on the tag end. This is the tag end. So as you turn the rod toward you, you want to take your other hand. I use my index finger. You can use whatever finger you want, and you just cross over, creating an X. All right? And then, keeping that tension, you continue turning the rod blank. Now this thread, this tag end, if you can see where it is right now, where it's situated, if I kept going, this would trap the tag end over this way. I want to keep it over here. Okay. So now it's going to stay over here. See, it's over here. And you just keep moving along, keeping your thumbs or your fingers, doesn't matter what it is. You can use your fingers too, like this if you want. I just find it easier with my thumb because I'm turning with my fingers. It's just the positioning of my hands. I think that it just helps to be that way. All right, once you get 3 or 4 or 5 wraps, I usually like to put about 4 down. The pressure of the thread wraps themselves are keeping this tag end from coming unraveled. So now you can just continue on wrapping like this. Now, you'll notice that this tag end is beginning to become a bit of a bother. Also, there's a little hump right there. So what I'm going to do, because I don't need that tag end anymore, is I'm going to cut it off. All right, you want to get it somewhat close, but you don't have to get it super close. You can also use a razor blade if you want. I prefer scissors because sometimes I nick the rest of the wraps while I'm cutting that tag end off, and it's frustrating. With the scissors, I can just bring them in, sort of lay them on the wraps and cut. So now you can just continue wrapping, and you've now covered that entire tag end. All right, So now when you're approximately, I'm going to say 8 to 10 wraps away from finishing this thread wrap, you want to put a tie-off loop in, and all that is a loop of thread. Some people use monofilament. I find monofilament gets stuck sometimes because it kinks, but this is thread that's very similar to the thread that I'm using. It's just a different color, just so you can see the difference. You can use the same color thread, the same thread if you want. Sometimes the tag ends are long enough to use for tie-off loops. So you want the loop to go toward the guide, or at least the direction that you're wrapping. So the loop should be down here. So there's my loop. And you want to tuck it right there. Don't be too aggressive. Just get it there and trap it underneath that wrap, just like that. At this point, you may want to check your angle. And you should check your angle throughout your entire thread wrap, because if it gets too severe, it may come back on itself and wrap back over these wraps. Not the end of the day, but it's a pain in the neck. I think what I might do is I'll show you what happens if you get too severe of an angle. See? Right there. So it's come over and you go, oh no, what do I do now? Don't panic. There are some thread wrappers that have a sprung rod with an eye on the top of it that will allow you to back that off because it keeps it under tension. The CRB thread wrapping tool is like that. What I do is I will take the bobbin off of the thread carriage, and I will get the thread under tension like this. So it's off camera, but I'm pulling on the thread in behind the tensioning device so that it comes back off of those wraps. Once it's back off the wraps like that, I replace the bobbin. All right. So if you want to back off the wrap like that, back the thread off of the wrap like that, make sure you pull it on the far side of your tensioning device, whatever that may be. That way, when you let go of it, the tensioning device keeps the tension on the thread. All right. Now what you want to do, without turning the blank, on this particular thread wrap jig, I have to move the blank so that it reduces that angle. You don't want to get rid of the angle, you want to keep an angle. You just want to reduce that angle so it doesn't wrap over itself. Okay, so there we have a pretty good angle right there. It's just a very slight angle that allows the thread to wrap in touching turns. Now, that means there's no gaps in the wrap, that you can see the blank through the wrap. So now you can just continue wrapping. Now once you get your 8, 10, dozen wraps over the tie-off loop, like so, again, look at the severity of my angle. I'll just pull it back like that just to make sure everything's nicely lined up. And what you want to do is you want to take your scissors or your razor blade. You want to put your thumb on the area where that tie-off loop is. because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be cutting this thread. And what happens when you cut that thread, if you don't have your thumb, you cut that thread, the thread's going to just unravel. So you want to put your thumb on there to keep it in place so it doesn't unravel. And then what I do is I give it a little bit of slack. The reason I do that is when I cut the thread, I don't get as much fraying on the end of the thread, and it's easier to put through the tie-off loop. So that tag end that I just cut goes through the tie-off loop like that. Okay? Then I take that thread, I've got it in my other hand now, I've got it in my right hand, so I can actually take my thumb off of here because I have this under tension again in my other hand. Then I take the tie-off loop, the end of it, and pull it under the wraps, just like that. Now, there's two different ways you can do this. I'll show you the way I do it first. So I've got it jammed against, getting ahead of myself there. I've got it jammed against the thread wraps, as you can see. Because of that, that loop, by virtue of jamming against the other wraps, has this thread under pressure. It's actually holding it in place. So I can let go of this one. All right. I'll get my scissors or my razor blade, take this tag end, cut it close. Be careful you don't cut the end of your tie-off loop. There is a little bit of it hanging there. You cut it close like that. Grab your tie-off loop. I like to put a little bit of pressure on those wraps as I'm pulling that little nub of the tag with the tie-off loop. Just like that. And there you have it. Once that's done, you can take your tape off. And use either your fingernail or your burnishing tool to clean up the wraps. Just tuck them close. I don't have my burnishing tool handy, but anything that's smooth, even the back of this razor blade, anything that's smooth, you can move thread wraps around with it. Don't use anything that's got like a pen, the barrel of a pen. Sometimes I'll use that as long as there's no printing on it. Anything that's rough may fray the thread. And there you go. The only other thing I'll say about this thread wrap is wherever you have tag ends, you'll notice that I pulled it under opposite where I started the wrap. So I got a bump there and a little bump there. Once this is finished, those will be virtually invisible. However, I still will put this on what they call the dirty side of the rod blank. And this will be the side that's underneath when you're holding the fishing rod in a normal fishing position. So any of your trim wraps, anything like that, all of those tag ends should be on this side of the blank. Okay, when you're fishing, that's what you're looking at. Everything else, all the work ends that you created are all on the bottom of the blank. And that's a basic thread wrap. Okay, this is another way of doing a basic thread wrap. It's the way you know, that a lot of people use, because starting out it keeps constant tension on the rod without having to think about it too much. So I'm not going to use the marker tape for the thread. I'm just going to wrap it on the way I normally do. But same start, come over the top, but instead of coming close like I did in the last one, I'm going to go in open spirals in the direction that I would be wrapping. And then I'm going to take a little piece of tape and I'm going to put it right there to hold that spiral in place. So the tape is acting as my tension in this case. So start it the same way. Start winding. When you get to where the thread meets itself, coax it over so you get that X again. There. With this method, you may have to keep coaxing it a little more than the other method, but you'll notice I don't have to keep tension on it. Okay? So you have started. So what you would normally do is you would take the tape off, because now the thread wraps are holding this part of the thread under tension, so it won't come unwrapped, it won't come loose. And you come to that point and you would cut that off, and that would be the start to your thread wrap. There's a similar way of doing this that I've seen a lot of people use. Let me just roll that thread back up. And that is doing the spirals again. But instead of putting a piece of tape on it, I'm just going to hold it in my hand. And then I can actually pull it and start the rod blank winding in the correct direction. And then I do my crossover. And I keep hanging on to that thread and pulling it. And I keep maintaining that crossover as I go along. There you go. So you take your, because I've got all that tension on the thread from the wraps themselves, I can now cut that tag end off and start my wraps. The only thing I don't like about that method is there tends to be a little bit more of a lump. Now there is a way of fixing that. If I hadn't cut it off, I could show you. But it involves grabbing that tag end and pulling it so that it's a little shorter of a lump. Problem with that is then you have to, if you want it on the dirty side of the blank, as I was talking before, you're going to have to compensate for that to get the right position. So, not my favorite way of doing it, but lots of people do it that way. In fact, probably the majority of people do it that way. So, let's pretend I'm about 12 wraps away from the end of my thread wrap. I'm going to put my tie-off loop in as I did before. do my 10 or a dozen wraps. There, all done. Put my thumb on it because I need to maintain the pressure there, because I'm giving this slack so that I can cut it. Okay. Back through the thread wrap, or back through the tie-off loop. Hold it in place. This time, this is a different way of ending your thread wrap. You can actually, I'm just going to cut a little bit of this off. You can actually pull that right through, like so. So again, this isn't my favorite way of doing it, because now you have to deal with this tag end that's sticking out in the middle of your thread wraps. It's not that big a deal. Sometimes bad things happen like this. This is all frayed now. So as long as you grab all of those frayed ends together, you take your razor blade, and this has to be super duper sharp to do this properly. Pull up on the thread so it's perpendicular to the blank. Lay your razor blade flat on the thread wraps and pull your thread against the blade, just like that. You notice how sharp that was. It just sort of melted through the butter, or like butter, through the thread wraps. Now there is a little tiny nub there, because there seems to be, no matter how hard you try to make it a perfect cut, it's not the end of the world. Your first coat of epoxy, you may end up with a little nub there. Take this same razor blade, just cut that little nub off, and the next time you put a coat of epoxy on, it's disappeared. But that's two ways of doing the basic thread wrap.